Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Daniel Siebold, Acting Dean of the Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. On behalf of the college, I welcome you to the Spring 2021 Donald J. Sutherland Lecture. The late Donald Sutherland established a distinguished and successful business career as an entrepreneur. A native of Long Island, he graduated from Princeton in 1953 and received an MBA from Harvard in 1958. In the 1970s, he founded Quincy Partners, one of the first leveraged buyout firms. From 1985 to 1987, Mr. Sutherland was the president of the Joffrey Ballet. He was also a trustee of the Joffrey, a governor of the New School for Social Research, and a trustee of Hofstra University. Since 1998, when Mr. Sutherland established this lecture series, speakers have included poet Robert Pinsky, novelist Salman Rushdie, presidential biographer Robert Caro, historian Deborah Lipstadt, and former US Senator Joe Lieberman. Hofstra College is grateful for Mr. Sutherland's generosity, and we thank the members of the Sutherland family for their continued support of the college. Today, we continue the best traditions of the Donald J. Sutherland Lecture with a timely lecture on trust. To introduce our speaker, I now recognize Dr. Amy Baer, Professor and Chairperson of the Hofstra Department of Philosophy.
Good afternoon. I am very pleased to introduce to you the Spring 2021 Sutherland Lecturer, Professor Kevin Vallier. Professor Vallier is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University. He writes and teaches in the areas of political philosophy, ethics, and the philosophy of religion, as well as in a field that has come to be called philosophy, politics, and economics, also known as PPE. PPE brings intellectual resources from economics, political science, and philosophy to bear on our understanding of the institutions of our political and economic life. At Bowling Green State University, Professor Vallier directs a novel PPE program for undergraduates, which adds a focus also on law. Professor Vallier has written 3 books and edited 4 volumes, and he is author of more than 40 peer-reviewed book chapters and journal articles. His books include Liberal Politics and Public Faith from 2014, Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, 2019, and Trust in a Polarized Age, published in 2020. This latter book is the basis for Professor Vallier's talk today. I have taught political philosophy and philosophy of law at Hofstra for 19 years. In my classes, I explore with students the difficult and important question of how society's basic institutions should be arranged and how state power should be used. A major challenge in the classroom has always been how to talk across political differences, how to talk in a way that is respectful and productive. As students who have taken my classes will know, doing that and doing that well is as important to student learning as it is to our public civic life. I very much look forward to Professor Vallier's insights and guidance concerning how we might, as a society, understand and deal with the growing problem of distrust and polarization in our political life. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. You may want to switch your Zoom setting to speaker view at this time. Also, after Professor Vallier speaks, there will be a question and answer period in which we will ask you to use the raise hand function. And then finally, Professor Vallier has agreed to make himself available for more informal conversation with students tomorrow from 1 to 2:25. If you plan to attend that meeting, please RSVP to me. I will put my email address in the chat, or you can simply put your email address in the chat, and we will consider that an RSVP for tomorrow's more informal conversation with Professor Vallier from 1 to 2:25. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Vallier.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I can't believe I'm giving a lecture that so many luminaries have given. So I hope to live up to it. Today, what I want to do is try to give you a framework for thinking about some of the political problems that we're having in the US, and that points a way to the future and some kinds of reforms that might solve those problems. So really, I'm going to be talking about both ideas of institutional and social trust and political polarization and how their interplay helps us to understand sort of what's going on. So I'll just sort of start with some dismal truths. So Americans are finding it harder and harder to trust one another. Social trust in the United States, our trust in our fellow citizens, faith that others will follow established norms has fallen dramatically. So in the mid 1960s, and here I want to go to show you a little bit of data, not too much, hopefully. So has gone from around 55% in the mid 60s, where most people when polled said that most people could be trusted. And that figure fell to about 31% in 2018. Now, this is a very big deal because in established democracies, social trust is extremely stable in most countries, UK, Sweden. It's pretty much a straight line with some fluctuations. The United States is the only established democracy that has seen anything like this large of a decline. There are other countries that have seen fluctuations and declines, but we're the only established democracy that's seen this pattern. As we'll see in a moment, this is very, very bad because social trust has very good consequences. So it's also the case that political trust, that's trust in government and democracy, has fallen pretty steeply as well. So throughout the 1960s, about 70% of Americans said they trusted the government in Washington all or most of the time. By the early 1990s, that number had fallen below 30%, and after a brief rebound in the early 2000s, it had collapsed to 17% in 2019. More troublesome still is that Americans reporting no confidence at all in their national government doubled from around 14% in 1995, then to 28% in 2017. Even in 2011, about 14% of people said they couldn't trust government. But in 2017, something changed. We could probably guess, but it doubled. So that's very, very worrisome. I'll come back to the main screen for a moment. Now, we see a similarly disturbing pattern in partisan distrust. So in 2017, around 70% of Republicans said they distrusted anyone who voted for Hillary Clinton for president. Likewise, around 70% of Democrats said they distrusted anyone who voted for Donald Trump. So people not only distrust politicians from other parties, which is good in some cases and helpful and essential, they distrust anyone who votes for the other party. That is many millions of people. So in our politically polarized age, we trust each other less simply based on how we vote. Worse, distrust is giving way to darker impulses like hatred. From 1980, when one measurement began, some members of each major political party reported that they hated the other one. But they used to be far fewer in number, between 10 to 20% of each party. In 2000, something changed. Now, as many as half of the members of each party despise the other party. It's unclear how a democracy can remain stable under these conditions. I mean, we surely don't trust those we hate, and we certainly don't want to be ruled by them even temporarily. So the other disturbing data here is a Pew poll that was taken in 2018 that breaks down trust levels by age. So I'm going to just turn to it. So the most trusting Americans are over 65, whereas the least trusting are by far the youngest. So you look here, these is a measure of 3 different questions. Most of the time, people just look out for themselves. Most would try to take advantage of you if they got a chance, and most people can't be trusted. So what we can see here in the gray is that around 29% of people said that are over 65 say most can't be trusted. That's pretty bad if you think about it, right? But around 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds agreed. Okay, so the number has doubled. There's one thing that we're learning from the trust research is that trust levels tend to harden in early adulthood. There is some evidence that it can change temporarily, but we've looked now at Swedish immigrants. So the Swedes are one of the most trusting countries. Sweden's one of the most trusting countries in the world. And when younger people leave Sweden for other countries, their trust levels will change to approximate, to some degree, the trust levels in their new country. But once they're over 30, there's no change at all. So what this suggests is that we face a low trust future as we transition from higher trust generations to lower trust generations. So that's the kind of situation that we're in. Now, why does trust falling really matter? I mean, we all kind of know implicitly that it does, but let me just talk through some of them. And in my book, in chapter 2, I go through them in great detail. So eroding social and political trust comes with grave costs. Falling social trust can undermine democracy, economic growth, and economic equality at the same time, the rule of law, the protection of minorities. It can foment tribalism and bigotry, weaken our capacity to form relations of friendship and love with those outside of our political in-group, and even negatively affect personal psychological well-being. Falling political trust makes it hard to form effective public policy. It can threaten democratic government and political stability and generate excessive inequalities of power, corruption, and violations of basic rights. Now, these phenomena aren't merely abstract, so I just want to work through some very vivid cases. You know, they really affect us very vividly. So allow me to sort of put you in that mindset for a moment, but fair warning. So recall your experience watching the hearings on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. I'm sure you remember Christine Blasey Ford claimed that Kavanaugh assaulted her in high school, accusations Kavanaugh fiercely denied. Now, most of the people here probably watched those hearings, and you were surely on one side or the other, completely convinced that you were correct. I was certainly of that mindset that one side was correct and the other was incorrect. And your friends these days, I mean, your friends probably agreed with you. Most of your family probably did too. There's probably some disagreements, but just recall how you felt in that moment. So you may have been right, okay? But you were also polarized, and you distrusted not just politicians on other sides, but supporters of those politicians. How could anybody look at this testimony and see it in a different way? So distrust and polarization occupy us socially and emotionally. This isn't just an intellectual problem. It's partly an issue in, you know, sort of our very emotional structures, right? If it was a purely intellectual problem, it would be a lot easier to address. Now, we can see other consequences of falling trust as well. Arguably, one recent effect of lower political trust is what political scientists call norm erosion. So norms, as we think about them in democracies, are, you know, really basic things. Don't say that there was massive voter fraud, facilitate the transition between power, release your tax returns so that people can see whether you're on the financial up and up. These aren't laws, or at least not yet, but they're norms. And when they erode, democracy erodes. So democracies only function if they're supported by norms that Levitsky and Zeblet say are, quote, the soft guardrails of democracy, preventing day-to-day political competition from devolving into a no-holds-barred conflict, unquote. So we need toleration and institutional forbearance to make democracy work. Otherwise, we can't keep political losers, the temporary political losers, integrated into the political system. For example, imagine that a US president made a temporary decision to deny funding to a foreign country to compel it to investigate one of his domestic political rivals, arguably with the intent to boost his chances of re-election. This, if it occurred, would severely erode norms that prohibit using state power to interfere with free elections. Such actions suggest that the future will lead to, quote, more departures from unwritten political conventions and increasing institutional warfare. In other words, democracy without solid guardrails. Forgive me. One might see the Republican decision to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court before the 2020 election as another case of norm erosion, following the refusal to hold a nomination hearing for Merrick Garland, with a Democrat threat of court packing as an attempt to respond in kind. That would be another form of norm erosion, even if you think it would be justified. So here again, we're not musing about an abstract intellectual issue, right? So we're encountering a real problem we can follow on the television or the internet every hour of the day. So pandemic's another example. Our government developed no federal plan for coordinating treatment of the virus. They simply didn't seem to believe at the highest levels in having a competent government response. So our low trust in government allowed us to elect officials who didn't trust it either. Further, we're heavily destructively polarized by an issue as simple as wearing a mask to keep people safe. What's more, we've seen, unfortunately, hypocritical behavior, particularly among political officials, but also even public health officials. I think one thing that caused a lot of frustration in the public was the tendency to condemn church gathering while refusing to recommend not attending the protests in July, not to mention inconsistent recommendations. But matters came to a head on January 6th, and we'll have to forever reckon with this and how we got here. When a group of insurrectionists attempted to overturn a fair election and potentially physically harm a host of high-ranking political officials due to a combination of their low trust and high polarization. So think about it. Okay? If these individuals were just low trust, they would have stayed home. No one could be trusted, right? And if they were just polarized, they would have at least believed the news media reporting that Trump lost the election. So it's the toxic mix of low trust and high polarization that made January 6th possible. That's why we have to bring these phenomena together. We can't just talk about polarization. If we're just polarized, but we're high trust, we can solve a lot of problems. If we're low trust, it's difficult, but at least we don't have to worry about polarization. It's when those things come together that we get a real problem. Falling trust creates even deeper problems, though, including in how we form our deepest beliefs in other domains. Partisan identities increasingly drive the formation of other social commitments, such as religious affiliation. Indeed, today, partisan affiliation is more stable than religious affiliation in the United States. With non-political identities in decline, partisan identities capture them, lining up other identities to help a political party defeat its opposition. For people who value these other identities, this is deeply troubling because politics is swallowing everything else. Consider this. 15 years ago or so, we saw a movement, the New Atheists, where they were making arguments against the rationality of theistic belief to the public. Where did it go? My view is that it was swallowed primarily by cultural politics. A number of the leaders got branded as right-wing. The rest moved in a left-wing direction. Where did the sort of open evangelical discourse go? Like the big revivals that say Billy Graham ran that were very bipartisan. What exactly has happened? Well, a lot of evangelical discourse went directly into support for Donald Trump. So it looks like it's sort of all, and I mean, there are pastors all over the country talking about the prevalence of things like nationalism and even a bit of sort of the QAnon conspiracy theory among their parishioners. So all we're coming to care about now is Team Red and Team Blue. I mean, we're not even as deeply disagreeing about economic issues as usual. So it's no wonder trust is on the decline because I think trust and polarization are in a kind of doom loop. Okay, so I brought you down. Let me try to bring you back up a little bit. So my review of the data supports the argument that we can only break polarization by restoring declining trust, and that only liberal democratic institutions can restore trust and do so justly. It looks like, in particular from what we can see with certain institutions, freedom of association, the use of markets, social safety nets, constitutional democracy, and fair and free elections can do a lot to restore trust and so to contain the damaging effects of polarization. So here I'm going to understand liberal institutions as those that protect a broad range of individual and group liberties from interference by other citizens and by government officials. Think here of the Bill of Rights, which is a paradigmatically liberal document when it's consistently applied to everyone. So constitutional democracy seems to create the most social and political trust from what I can tell, with markets in second, social safety nets in third, freedom of association fourth, electoral democracy in last place. But they all sustain social trust and political trust, and they do so in a just way. So for this reason, I think liberal politics has the internal resources to save us from a downward spiral of increasing polarization and decreasing trust. So what I call liberal rights practices, when we take these rights and we decide to exercise them, we can increase social and political trust and dampen partisan polarization. So we can resolve the distrust and polarization doom loop without going outside the liberal policy toolkit. That is, we really can hold on to our institutions and address these problems rather than having to do something totally different politically. So allow me to work through some examples, starting with freedom of association. We use freedom of association to form and participate in organizations that very often serve the public. So associational life can create social trust by putting youth in particular into positive contact with others that may never have encountered before. It's true that people who join associations were already highly trusting, but we've seen in many domains that positive contact in social life can increase social trust. I've also argued that associational rights are morally justified to a wide range of different groups, including those who would otherwise reject liberal democracy. because many illiberals or non-liberals place special value on community, and freedom of association helps to preserve that. In my view, we can increase trust by issuing protections for organizations through legal exemptions from certain kinds of expanding progressive social legislation. So take the Equality Act right now. I do support the expansion of civil rights to people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. The worry with the Equality Act is it limits the earlier Religious Freedom Restoration Act and has too few religious exemptions. And I think this is going to exacerbate fears among many religiously conservative populations, not just white either, but in many minority communities, that their church-run institutions are going to be sued or regulated so that they can't stay in line with the teachings of their churches. There'll be exemptions for churches themselves, but church-run institutions, people who operate small businesses according to conscience, that's going to start to be pretty limited. And in my view, something like the Utah Compromise is a good way to go. So I can talk more about religious exemptions. They're sort of controversial these days. And it's interesting, in the early 90s, it was the right that opposed many religious exemptions and the left who supported them. But things are different today. Okay, so now let's turn to the market economy. Markets can be understood as exchange protected by private property in capital goods. That is, the goods that make other goods. Your ability to own a factory, to have an investment, to run a small business. This has nothing to do with what the tax rate is. Okay, so having markets, Sweden has a lot of markets, and they have, in many ways, well-protected, unregulated markets, or somewhat regulated markets, but they have very high taxes. So when I say legally protected property rights, I mean that people have the freedom to start a business or invest. They know where their property lines are. They can get a mortgage. These are things that are not well protected in many countries, where it takes forever to start a business, or you don't even know where your property lines are. So if someone builds on your property, you can't take them to the small claims court. So that's the sense in which I'm defending markets. I'm not talking about tax rates. I'm just talking about stable legal property rights in the law. And in these cases, free exchange aligns our incentives for gain with peaceful behavior, increasing trust. So when we have positive market interactions, we can become more trusting. So think about more developed market societies where you walk into a grocery store, you buy any kind of food at all, you go to the cashier, you're not worried about being ripped off. But then there are other situations where you go to buy a used car and you really aren't sure about the person that you're dealing with. Positive interactions can build trust over time. Negative interactions can diminish it, right? And we can see that in these two kinds of economic transactions we engage in. And this may surprise you, but the orders that appeal most to free markets are the most highly trusting regimes, although the reasons why are kind of more complex. Private property rights can also be justified to many perspectives because they help to promote economic growth, and they allow diverse groups to work together for a common good through spontaneous coordination of people through market prices. One way, and I think many of you who have worries about the market economy, but you might agree with me on this, one way that we can expand markets to help restore trust is by lowering the price of housing, particularly in major cities. This is in particular by making it harder for people to residentially zone things so that, for instance, you can only have single family housing in many parts of a city like San Francisco. So by removing those real estate restrictions, which I think should be accomplished by putting a lot of real estate zoning at the state level, rather than the local level where they get captured by the rich. This will boost economic equality by making the poor richer, that is, allowing workers to live in large cities that they couldn't live in before, but also lowering the real wealth of the rich gained through excessive zoning in their favor. But at the same time, allowing for cheaper housing can increase economic growth because more people can live in productive parts of the economy. All right, now let's move on to social services. These are forms of redistribution that are largely aimed at reducing poverty and extreme social risks. Economic security helps people feel that society isn't leaving them behind, reducing resentment. And we are starting to see some new data where there do seem to be some declines in social trust from unemployment scarring. It looks like people feel that not having a job is society being indifferent to them. So you want certain kinds of protections so that people don't feel like they're being kicked to the curb. So social services also narrow economic inequalities that many, especially on the left, perceive as unfair. They temper the risks of the market order, making people more comfortable with markets. This is one of the reasons I think that Sweden was able to move from what we would call democratic socialism to what we call a capitalist welfare state today. Because they had such strong social safety nets, people weren't as worried about the negative effects of markets because they were insulated from many of them. And I think that social services can be justified to most perspectives based on fear of poverty, recognizing extreme need, and the sense that having something to fall back on can reduce domination and control by powerful social groups. One of my favorite programs that's best empirically substantiated is the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil, which provides mothers with a cash transfer in exchange for having their children vaccinated and sending them to school. This reduced child poverty in Brazil quite a great deal, so much so that over 40 countries have copied the policy. Now let's turn to the operation of democratic governance at the congressional level. We need to reduce corruption in Congress. So HR 1, the For the People Act, before Congress now, has some provisions that worry me, particularly broader public databases of even smallish political contributions. I mean, I'd support them for very large ones, but Title 8, if you look it up, has some really helpful anti-corruption measures, like requiring leading political officials to disclose their tax returns by law, making it harder for people in government to immediately get jobs in the private sector after they leave office. So there'll be 3 to 5 years in between. So you can't just go through the sort of golden revolving door between private and public so easily. So they're freer from corporate control and lures in that way. I think these policies are not so hard to justify because anti-corruption legislation helps people feel that their votes matter and that government can be trusted to produce good policy. And we also, of course, need to prevent certain groups at the state level from limiting voting rights at the state level. So HR 1 would establish automatic voter registration. So I think people would feel secure in their ability to help select their leaders. Now, I can't address every issue, but I think that's at least something of a tour of what I argue. I'm most eager to find ways to increase trust in media, since bad reporting can relay bad information about which institutions are trustworthy. So without media trust, we can't calibrate our trust to true trustworthiness in our institutions or in one another. But we could talk about this more in the Q&A because I'm not so sure about how to reform media helpfully. So my hope overall is that increasing trust will take a large bite out of polarization, since people will become more trusting of others and of government, even when the other party's in power. Polarization is much less problematic under conditions of trust, since people will see those who offer different policies as persons of goodwill, even if they disagree with their political agenda. So the democratic rotation of power can occur with less friction. Of course, the challenge here is how to get the process of reform in motion. That requires something of each of us. First, I think we really do have to fight our own distrust of our political opponents. Otherwise, we're likely to interpret everything they do as evil and wicked and take that as further evidence that we were right about them all along. To begin to trust, we have to reflect on our own intellectual limitations and try to adopt an attitude of humility. None of us have all the answers, and every one of us is likely to be wrong on some important political issues. The other side just might help us get at the truth, at least from time to time. Second, we have to allow ourselves to recognize that our non-political interactions with our opponents are positive and give us reasons to trust them. Perhaps some of you are sealed in an ideological bubble, but most of us aren't. You probably regularly interact with some people whose politics differ from your own. You may not have even noticed that their politics are different. And the ways they've treated you give you no grounds to mistrust them. Third, it's helpful to take a global perspective on our problems. Few developed liberal democratic societies face our levels of polarization and distrust, at least not to the same degree. Some not at all. And finally, we can look at our own recent past for evidence that things can get better because matters weren't always so grim. I don't think our condition is terminal. But there are two kinds of responses that I think won't work. So right-wing populism proposes a kind of American nationalism that has served as a basis for social unity in the past, typically during wars. So nationalism indeed creates social and political trust by defining the nation against some enemy or threat. Wars do bind us together, and those bonds help our society survive. You can see this just by tracking the spikes in social and political trust over time, especially the decline starting in the early 1970s. Arguably, World War II, we can't prove this, was trust creating, whereas Vietnam was trust reducing. The right-wing populist argues that increasing nationalist sentiment in the right ways will create World War II effects rather than Vietnam effects. But we don't want to base trust on constant warfare. And in times of peace, nationalist leaders tend to search for a new foe, typically an enemy within the nation, people who don't fit the interpretation of national identity held by those with political power. These efforts may increase trust among people who fit the nationalist definition of the nation, but they'll decrease trust between the nationalist in-group and his inevitable out-group. This isn't the way to create trust among all Americans. Suppose, again, just for example, a US president were to lead a public chant to send a female Muslim congresswoman of color back to her country of origin. That may create fellow feeling among the president's supporters, but it frustrates trust among people with different genders, ethnicities, and faiths. But I will say, and not to equate the two, but that we do need to look at both sides as part of this project, that left-wing social egalitarianism also creates some dangers for trust. This view holds not merely that persons are equal, but here's the key, that disagreement about how equality applies in matters of things like gender identity is unreasonable, and that such views should be socially and even legally repressed. So the thought here is it's one thing to support expanding the circle of social equality. It's one thing to dismiss those who deny this as bigoted. Okay, so this view, it isn't going to sow distrust among immigrants and citizens, but it does still tribalize us between the groups that are sort of get it and the groups that don't get it. So social egalitarians can sometimes demonize more privileged members of society, as opposed to calling attention to injustices and the reform required to produce them. And in some cases, we've seen some egalitarians denounce people who aren't especially privileged, like white working class males without college degrees, and very religious citizens. So these are trust-reducing practices, in my opinion. So in his book that's now well known, Patrick Deneen argues that to call for the cures of liberalism's ills by applying more liberal measures is tantamount to throwing gas on a raging fire. It will only deepen our political, social, economic, and moral crisis, unquote. But if I'm right, we really do need more liberalism. If we protect central liberal rights and support those who exercise them, we can overcome the mistrust and conflict that some claim liberalism engenders by nature. So we have to resist different kinds of illiberal forces, double down on the institutions that we have, recognizing that they're flawed, but that they can be improved. Now, I'm alive to the non-liberal concern that liberalism as an ideology has deleterious social effects. A liberal ethos can become sectarian and authoritarian, and beating up on those with more traditional social and political views, or those on the left, and it can often be seen as socially atomizing, destroying older social bonds that are hard to replace. But I have no interest in defending liberalism as an ethos. Instead, what I'm doing is defending liberal rights practices, right? Constitutional rights and their exercise. And in my view, liberalism's contemporary critics haven't shown that we can only have liberal institutions if we have a liberal ethos. In my view, and just to try to end on a high note, that we should be proud of liberal civilization, the gradual, very difficult progress that has been made. And we have good reason to hope that liberal orders have the internal resources to end the cold civil war that we're currently waging against one another. So maybe we soon return to the irritating, exhausting, and deeply flawed politics of liberal democracy. So through liberal reforms, we can, paraphrasing Sigmund Freud, turn our hysterical, polarized misery into common political unhappiness. So with any luck, I've tried to given you a sort of framework for thinking about how trust and polarization work together for ill, but that how distrust and polarization, but then how they might be addressed together within the institutions that we have. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate your attention and your time.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We're going to have plenty of time now for Q&A, and I am not going to be reading questions or comments put in the chat, but rather calling on folks who use the raise hand function. I would like to invite students to come to the front of the line, so to speak. Are there any students who would like to ask a question? Okay. Isabel.
Yeah, hi. First of all, I thought this was really interesting and I really liked your lecture. You talked about adopting humility for our opponents. And I think that's something I personally struggle with because I am on the left side. And I was just wondering how we can go about adopting humility for people who at least seem like they wish others bad. I'm talking about like during like Black Lives Matter movements when it's all lives matter and stuff like that. Because although I want to understand the other side, I have a hard time trying to sympathize with people who aren't trying to sympathize with other people, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering kind of how do we go about trying to understand and sympathize with people like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the difficult thing is sort of looking at people in a more sort of complex way. So first, you want to separate people who maybe are on the other side into those who are the loudest and those who are not. Usually the media draws attention to the people with the wildest and most, frankly, I guess, click promoting views. And so, you know, I've found, you know, periodically I'll have a family member that I had a family member once that I mentioned Black Lives Matter and he just started screaming and yelling about it, but that most people, how bad it was. But for the most part, you know, the resistance has been to misunderstandings, just simple misunderstandings of what's being advocated. It's also the case that while we do have to distinguish between reasonable and unreasonable views, that we can look at people as having a single person as having some reasonable views and some unreasonable views. So one thing that I try to do is just separate out different issues. And I can say, you know, on that issue, they're off. On that issue, I don't sympathize. But there's other things that I do sympathize with. They do have a point on this, that, and the other thing. So trying to empathize with others doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, that we can't condemn them, that we can't think at least on one issue, they've really got it wrong and in a way that they should fix. And so what I try to do sometimes when I'm feeling that way is try to focus on other issues. Now, sometimes you'll encounter someone on social media that's just so caught up in it that, you know, you just have to unfollow them or unfriend them or block them or whatever. I mean, that's just social media. That's just life. But I think it is, we try to distinguish. There's always more diversity in a group that we can always see more diversity in a group when we're a member of it. Right. And so what I try to do is say, okay, well, these loud voices aren't necessary. Maybe they're not representative. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they aren't. So you have to kind of work at it, I guess is what I would say. But okay. It's a very good question. It's a very hard question. Yeah.
Yeah. I liked what you said about they can be wrong on one issue and not other issues, because I think we do kind of tend to paint with like a big brush that like, oh, if they don't believe this one thing, they must be wrong on all of them. And for, yeah, the loudest people, that might be true. But for, I think, a lot of people, there's more diversity than that.
Yep. Yep.
Great. I believe that Lai Patel is next. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
Yeah, it's Lay.
Lay, sorry.
Okay, my question was, well, there was a recent study conducted by the Cato Institute, which found that 62% of Americans said that they have political views they're afraid to share. How can we have a free exchange of ideas with this fear over our head that prevents us from engaging in discourse that leads to change and consequently a better society?
Yeah, this is a terribly difficult issue. You know, I like to say that I have no political home. Like I'm a heterodox member of any political or religious group I've been a member of ever. And so I think about this a lot because I have a weird kind of eclectic mix of views. And so I've had to keep a lot of silence depending on who I'm spending time with. And the straightforward answer is that people with a lot of social influence just have to have a little courage and be willing to take a little heat. If elites aren't willing to do it, then the people at the bottom of the ladder are just going to get severely socially punished. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting data now on social change having to do with how social norms are established and the role of what Christina Bicchieri, a philosopher at Penn, calls trendsetters. They're basically cultural elites that help to establish norms or undermine them. And one of the difficulties that we have with social media is that the cost of social punishment have plummeted. And what's often called cancel culture, I think, is simply pile-ons. So one thing I would like to do is, if you're going to socially punish, Twitter charges you a very small fee. So people who sit around doing it all the time, they have to stop. Just finding some, so one way is finding some way to reduce the ease of social punishment on social media. You really ought to get in trouble if you dox somebody pretty quickly, if you reveal their personal information. So one, we have to reduce the ease of social punishment, because this is one reason that people feel afraid. They can't say it on social media, then they feel like they can't say it in the real world, even though in the real world, people are a lot less polarized and a lot kinder to each other. But I do also think it would help a lot if we had a certain kind of, I don't know how we would exactly do this beyond convincing the social media companies, although I do think increasingly they should be regulated, and we're getting a bipartisan, more of a consensus on that. That we have to reduce the ease of social punishment, because what that's doing is creating this sense that people can't speak their minds. There's another issue, though, that's also going on, and I don't really entirely know how to understand this, but that the corporate world used to at least sort of feign political neutrality. And that's just gone now in many places. So, I mean, because there's enormous social pressure on these groups. For instance, I don't know how many of you follow Oreo's Twitter account, but you know, they had a tweet, and I'm not saying they shouldn't say this, but this is just an illustration. And I had a tweet: trans people exist, right? Now, I mean, it's good to believe that, obviously, but it is kind of odd that, you know, Oreo is taking a stand on this sort of thing. You might think you know, it's good, again, that people believe it, but I think what you're getting in the corporate world is a kind of pressure to express certain kinds of views that, while perhaps correct, makes people feel like they can't say anything. So Oreo takes that stand. What if the many people working for Oreo think, okay, well, that's, you know, they're on board with the whole agenda, I better keep my views to myself. So that's another worry, is that the social pressure is now being applied to people in their places of employment, and that puts people's jobs on the line. So what I wonder is if there shouldn't be some kind of employment protections for Twitter comments, particularly Twitter comments that are deleted. I think this would help a lot if people didn't feel like they could lose their jobs over this stuff, unless it was just constant and they dug in, right? I don't think one tweet should cost anyone their job if they delete and apologize. And I'll say this: I think that includes Roseanne Barr, but it includes a lot of other people too, and people are getting hurt all over the political spectrum. So it's not limited to the right by any means. So we need to raise the cost of social punishment. Elites have to stand up more. Corporations need to think hard about when their leadership takes positions on these issues. So sorry, I had a lot to say about that, because I think it's a really serious problem. But there's a number of different things that would need to happen, I think.
Thank you for that question, Lei. I believe the next question is from Dejan, and forgive me also if I have mispronounced your name.
It's Dayan. That's okay. Thank
Dan.
you. Okay, great. Thank you. Wait, let me unraise my hand. First of all, thank you so much for coming to talk with us. And you get it. Thank you so much. My question, I just want to go back to like the beginning of the talk and to the social trust graph. And you mentioned Sweden, which is a country that has very, very strong welfare programs to kind of set a nice base for everybody to live upon. So my question was, in societies and countries with more like incipient or maybe non-existent support networks like that, like Sweden's, which is arguably, well, for instance, most of the third world, by the way, I'm from a developing country myself. My question would be, how do you break, but that these countries do participating like a free market economy or social free market economy, whatever you name it. My question would be, how do you kind of break that cycle of the people being like, oh, I don't trust the government, so I don't want to pay more taxes, but those taxes would fund programs that would eventually make me trust more the government, but I don't want to do it because they haven't been doing it yet.
Yeah, my view is you have to go kind of step by step. I mean, there's a lot of the nice thing about trust in government is that it varies, and it can change a lot, and it can change a lot for a particular person. So particularly one way to build political trust is strong perceived economic performance. So people all over the world expect their governments to make sure that they can have I mean, not every single person, but that their governments improve their economic well-being. Now, of course, you need some trust in government to even get that process going. But there are a lot of things that developing countries have the state capacity to do it a little bit better with respect to the growth rate. It also has to be broad-based. It has to reach everybody. If it's seen as only reaching a few, that's also a problem. But there are a lot of, I mean, every country was once a developing country. And so there's a lot of countries that have passed through those stages. And what will frequently happen is that there's a very good book on this, Why Nations Fail, that talk about limiting what are called extractive institutions. So ones like autocracy and unequal access to markets, where you have a state like, say, Saudi Arabia, where the benefits of wealth go to a few and there's no democratic input. So most people don't have access to markets. Most people can't vote. So what you want is to move gradually towards those things. So the idea is that, you know, you're not going to get there all at once, but a lot of countries have gotten there piece by piece. And in many cases, you see kind of big institutional jumps, you know, every generation or so. You know, we had our own fair share, right? Things like the New Deal and Great Society and so on. I'm not saying every one of those programs were good by any stretch of the imagination, but many were helpful. So yeah, I would just say you look at the history of developed countries. Sweden actually has, I have a co-author, Andreas Berg, who has a history of the Swedish welfare state. And Sweden actually did not have a very extensive welfare state at the beginning of the 20th century, or even well into the 20s and 30s and even 40s. So they had a lot of institutional capital that they were able to build on, but they expanded their welfare state pretty quickly. And then they reformed it pretty quickly when they found that certain things weren't working. So the hardest thing is for countries that are very low trust. But here's something to give you a little hope. Brazil is one of the lowest social trust countries in the world. Sometimes it comes in at polling at about 5% of people saying most can be trusted. And yet they got Bolsa Familia on the table. They were able to move in such a way as to reduce child poverty considerably. So it's important to take certain steps. And one thing I would stress is that you have to expand markets too. Because if you don't expand markets, you don't get the kind of growth that you need to expand services. So for many people I know who are listening that have their worries about markets, I think it's pretty clear from development that you have to have markets and public investments, and they have to go together. And that very few countries have developed without doing both of those things at the same time. So I think that's just kind of where the data is, but you can get there. Other people have, and even low trust countries are able to move in that direction, which, you know, is surprising, I think, in some ways, but it's hopeful.
Thank you. We have a question from Eddie Fritz.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to go back to that last cancel culture-ish question a little bit. You mentioned that we need to limit the ease of social punishment, I think was your wording.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But in reality, like, what punishment, like, other than in cases in criminal and not, like, or like, do we see cancel culture really affecting celebrities or like big strokes in general? Like I can think of like Louis C.K. is still doing comedy shows, and Kevin Hart is still a successful comedian, even though he didn't get to host the Oscars because of a couple of tweets. And then like down to like that more local level of like people losing their jobs over, you know, internet squabbles and what they say online. I mean, like growing up, right? I was always told you got to be careful what you post on social media because future job interviews, future employers, whatnot, they're going to look at that. So if they are like, so if there's supposed to be like, is social media supposed to be like this easy to look at place with like a non-contrasting views where you can just like your grandma's photos, or should it be used in that tool? And if so, is cancel culture in a sense a subset of having that existence, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I want to think about it in terms of degree. You know, you certainly want to be able to criticize people, and in some cases pretty strongly. The question is how to limit the social punishment to it being proportionate, right? That would be the ideal, right? Someone says something mean or cruel, and then they're reprimanded. And another thing is that people are forgiven. That's a norm really losing. Someone could say, I'm sorry, and then they can get back to normal eventually. There have been more celebrity cancellations than that, though I do think the most recent case being, I think it's Gina Carano, with respect to the being removed by Disney from The Mandalorian. I mean, the details are sort of complicated. We don't know exactly how much they were going to use her in season 3. And there were a couple of different incidents as well. But so there are a few examples. But I think you're right. It's mostly, a lot of it's punching downwards or sideways to people who were in other positions. But I think the real problem isn't so much that one person's upset. The real problem is there's like 10,000 people. They whip themselves up into a frenzy. 100 of them call their employer, and the employer just doesn't know what to do and feel like their account's going to get attacked. They're going to be attacked. Then people are going to associate their account and buy few of their products. So what I'd like to be able to do is find ways to limit those stages. And I don't know how to do it. I mean, should there be expanded employment protections for social media activities, right? Like if if there's a bad tweet, it has to be, reviewed. If you want to fire someone based on their social media presence, that has to be reviewed by a court or something like that. I don't know what the solution is. I couldn't tell you. Whatever it is, though, I want to put little steps that make it a little more expensive to do it, because I think if you can stop the piling on and get it proportionate, then it would be like what you say, where you just kind of suffer the consequences of your actions. But so the issue right now isn't that you don't suffer consequences, it's that you suffer disproportionate consequences. If you can increase the costs along the way to someone getting severe social punishment, then maybe we can get to something proportionate. But it's a very hard problem. And my suspicion is that a lot of this could be fixed just within Twitter, because that's where most of it happens, with respect to that, even just the Twitter algorithms being able to limit those kinds of things. Yeah, I can't tell you because I don't know the law. I don't know what's possible policy-wise, but that's the theory. The theory is at each little step, try to increase certain kinds of protections from these things happening. Because I mean, I think really a lot of the problem, the debate is, people on the right will say, oh, look, someone was canceled. People on the left will say that, well, they're just being reprimanded. And what's actually going on is that they're both correct. But what's going on is there's a sand dune of tiny condemnations, right? And so one side sees the tiny condemnations and thinks those are all appropriate. But then when they add up to the sand dune, they say, oh, and that, someone gets trapped in it, and that's it. So you've got to reduce the degree and number of punishments. If you can do that, then I think that'll help.
Thank you. I want to, I'm going to call in some more hands. I just want to remind everyone that we're taking questions verbally. If you'd like to ask your question, please do use the raise hand function. Also, if it turns out that there isn't enough time for your question to be entertained, please note that Professor Vallier will be available tomorrow from 1 to 2:25. And if you'd like to participate in that informal conversation tomorrow, please do put your email address in the chat, and we will be in touch with you and send you a link to that meeting. So I believe the next hand up is Robert Barsh.
Yes, hello. Hi. So you mentioned very briefly media trust. And so I believe most people agree that some of the reason for that mistrust is kind of a result of financial incentives, right? Where you're appealing to an existing readership. You have, as they say, clickbaity headlines, and you have to court advertisers, right? So you have to say things within their sensibilities. So how do you suggest countering those incentives to have a more honest news?
Yeah, I mean, this is like the question that I'm really struggling with, and I've been struggling with very much for the last 2 months, since 1/6. We have some good media sources. I mean, we do. And then we have some really bad ones. So the question is, why are there good ones at all? Why aren't they all bad? My only answer that I know of is journalistic ethics. And also, I think some competition between media sources is salutary. Like if they'll expose each other's errors sometimes. But I mean, the culture of journalism is one of we need social norms that extend more broadly. I've thought about this. I don't want to blow up the conversation, but what about affirmative action for conservatives in journalism schools? I mean, it's just something to consider. So if you think the problem is greater on the right, at least currently, and you think that people pick up the norms in journalism schools, maybe it biases them, maybe they're useless, but that's probably that and early on the job when those norms get instilled. If you have lots of people on both sides that are absorbing and internalizing the norms, then they won't always go for the quick buck. They sometimes will. They sometimes will, but sometimes won't. I can also imagine trying to push for more impartiality on public radio. I actually think NPR is pretty good by comparison to almost anything else. But yeah, nonprofit sources, it would be good to expand them in various ways. But I can't say anything except that you really want a certain kind of journalistic ethics to be widely prevalent. And they, I was talking with Amy about this before we started, but it wasn't always that way in the US. I mean, if you look at a lot of the journalism around the time of the founding, or the stuff people said about Jefferson in the election of 1800, this is pretty, and there's a reason that John Adams, before that tried to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. People were saying nasty stuff about him. The beginning of widespread newspapers and yellow journalism was all kinds of problematic, but there were efforts made to try to inculcate a kind of journalistic code of ethics. And I think that all you can really say is that you want to propagate those norms. So what's the best way to propagate those norms? Put as many people through the norm inculcation process as you can. But I don't know a good way to do that. But I do think that that a lot of this isn't often absorbed on the right, because, and not that there aren't problems on the left. Okay, so don't get me wrong, but they aren't absorbed on the right in part because a lot of journalism on the right doesn't go through the same norm inculcation process. And I mean, it's imperfect, right? So like on Fox, and my sports is 24-hour news and politics. Like that's my sort of guilty pleasure. I'm sure it messes with my mind in various ways. I come away with some false beliefs, but it's fun. There's a real difference between the strict journalists and the pundits. And they really, if you look into it, they really disagree behind the scenes as well. So, you have a lot of really good journalists at Fox, a lot of really good journalists. But then you have other forces that are sort of pulled by the clickbait and all that kind of stuff. And one thing I've often wondered, especially if you look at like org charts of the media in the United States, the media system. There's a great book on this, Network Propaganda. There's so many more nodes on the left that it's much harder to coordinate everyone on the left on a false story. Not that it never happens, but that it's much harder to do because it's just a coordination problem, right? That, you know, a few people are wrong, others say, oh, they're wrong. Whereas on the right, there are just fewer media organizations. So it's easy for them to all get something wrong. So one thing I would want, and this is going to surprise everybody, but I think there should be more conservative news organizations, a lot more, because then it's harder to make certain kinds of errors. I also think, and this is just to throw something else out there, that we've been in a really unusual and weird media environment for the last 4 years, in virtue of having a president that directly attacks the press, particularly at rallies, where journalists are often, hopefully my camera's not going out. My camera's staying on. Oh, good. You go to a rally and there's 10,000 people and you're trying to record, and then you're pointed at and said, there's the fake news back there. You're going to internalize that. And I was talking with Amy about this before, when you start trying to say like, oh, the president's lying, it's not just like one lie, it's just all the time. That just affects you emotionally. And so it's harder to remain unbiased in those conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think we've just been in a really tough news period. And I don't think we'll always be in it. And we haven't always been in it either. So I'm just throwing some ideas out there. You need broader bipartisan internalization of journalistic ethics. I think that matters. And you need a lot more conservative, different types of conservative news organizations to help to break up the problem. And I also think that journalists on the left encountering people with values from the right would be very, very good for them as well. And general contact and interaction tends to be a good thing for people. The polarization effects don't show up as much as you would think.
Great. I'd like to call on a colleague from the law school, Brenner Fissel.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for engaging with me on Twitter last week. I'm trying to understand, I guess, what your deeper commitments are, because you have this fascination with integralism, but also I saw you. And I don't think you are an integralist, but I saw you also. No. Right. So I saw you engaging with the Rawls discussion on the 100th anniversary last week. But I think it's important to really clearly articulate what you think trust is helping us to achieve, right? So I don't think that there's any political philosophy that stops at trust or maybe communitarians, right? But it seems like that would still be in service of a deeper goal. So I'm wondering what your deeper goals are. You were described in the invite as a classical liberal, but I see you are sort of advocating for some redistribution of wealth through the social safety net as well. So I'm just curious what your deeper commitments are. Thank you for coming.
Good. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the engagement. You can all follow me on Twitter at @kvallier. That's my handle. I told you people earlier that pretty eclectic, so it's hard to explain in a novel way. The first thing I would do is distinguish between my ideal theory, that is what I think is the best, and then what I'm advocating as a matter of non-ideal theory. So one of the things I think is most important right now that I do in my work is that I'm very interested in restoring unity and trust. But that doesn't mean I get my way all the time, right? That means I have to also have a theory of how much I can compromise with others. So personally, it's also the case though in the classical liberal tradition broadly, classical liberalism and libertarianism aren't the same thing. So that's been kind of confused in partly in philosophy and law because the story's sort of complicated, but Nozick is the one who got all the attention and he had the most anti-redistributionist views. But then all the classical liberals that were friendly to redistribution, like F.A. Hayek, philosophers just didn't read them. So I have the encyclopedia entry, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on neoliberalism that'll come out in a few months, and that'll give you a sense for the kind of classical liberal figures that I think didn't get the right attention, and so it does seem like it's weird that a classical liberal would be for social services. It's actually not. It's actually not that weird. My next book project is indeed to address a certain kind of new religious conservative that has kind of lost complete faith in liberal democracy, and that just prefer to try to win the culture war, right? Just, it's not, there's no peace. So on this view, even for theological reasons, you can't make peace with sort of secular elites as they think of them. All you can do is win and then rule, because there's just no other option. So some people are so stuck in the war mentality that you've seen a revival of the views of the German and eventually Nazi social theorist Carl Schmitt, who thought that politics was inherently premised on a friend-enemy distinction. So I take liberalism to be about pursuing the possibility of peace between different groups. And that's kind of the deepest part of my liberalism. And it's one of the ways that my liberalism goes out of my faith, and seeing the possibility of the real possibilities of peace that are all around us. So there is this view that, we have to win. We can't make peace because there is no peace. And so I'm trying to develop an engagement with this view that I think in one way, its intellectual seriousness is gravely underrated, because it's very, very natural for people historically to think, well, what should the state do? It should do what's best for human beings. That's the common historical view going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, right? So if you think you have the truth, many of you are religious, you have a religious tradition. Why not think that the state should be promoting your view? What's wrong with you? Why don't you, for the people having the right views that will help them perhaps in this life and the next, right? And the integralist challenge is just the Catholic version of this view. And as a Christian, I think it's a challenge. You think, well, why should my views be in charge? Why am I a liberal? Why do I support separation of church and state? Does it even make any sense at all? And so I'm trying to probe that question at a very, very deep level, and to see whether indeed one's religious commitments can be compatible with a certain kind of religious toleration. So, for those of you who have any philosophy background, to me, this position is a bit like utilitarianism was to Rawls. It's a view that has a highly respectable lineage. In the case of integralism, Aquinas, Suarez, many of the 19th century popes that were very, very thoughtful. But that I think is wrong-headed morally and that will undermine political stability. These were precisely Rawls's issues with utilitarianism. So to me, Aquinas is what Sidgwick was to Rawls. So it's a view I take very seriously because I think it has a certain kind of internal logic. And Brenner and I were interacting about it because he was asking why I took it so seriously. So I guess 3 points. One, what I'm talking about to you today is my non-ideal theory. It's the theory of, if we're going to disagree about justice and the good life, how do we come together? So that's the one thing. But I do have other personal commitments as a matter of politics or faith, but I try to integrate my non-ideal theory into those ideal theories. And I try to say that what we're really after, allow me to get a little gooey, I think we're here to love each other. And that our ultimate destiny is to draw near to each other. And that that's what we were meant to be, and who we're meant to be. And so all of my work is trying to think through that idea at every level. And so that's what's, if you asked about my deepest commitment, that's the deepest commitment. That's the deepest commitment, is that we're meant to come together. And so I'm trying to figure out, grapple with a very deep level, is that even possible in our world? Or do we just have to back off and say, look, I'm right, you're wrong, let's go. So I'm very, very engaged with views that just say, look, there's just no alternative. So anyway, thanks for that question. I went on too long, but you asked me like the deepest question you could ask. So there you go.
Thank you for that. I believe Jergy is next.
Yes, thank you. So I had two questions. The first, so regarding social medias, the first one was, what do you think about these very influential people who, despite the fact they don't have any political formation, they still share their opinion on social media and use their status of celebrity to give political opinions, so, and maybe influence to further distrust. So is it a good or a bad thing that we have these influential people with this status acting this way? And the second question was, how come there's this huge difference between Europe and America when it comes to listen to celebrities who gives opinion on politics? For example, I remember in Europe, Cristiano Ronaldo, who's a very influential soccer player, had made a statement criticizing how the virus was being handled and complaining about all the restriction. And Ronaldo was heavily criticized by the fans. Instead, we see in America many of these athletes and other celebrities who deliberately give opinions are, let's say, supported even more or receive more attention.
I mean, it's difficult because you always have to ask, in the case of your first question, what are the alternatives, right? What's the alternative to forming your opinion on social media? Someone's going to form it. It might be nice if many of us sat down and read different people and made up our minds, but most people don't have time for that. So they've got to rely on other people doing it. So what you want are kind of healthy epistemic networks, to use kind of a philosophical term. And you want, you know, the people that you're getting your cues from to kind of be reflective rather than, you know, out just to attract likes and so on. There's a lot of interesting questions around what makes for a healthy social elite, because one way or another, there are always people that have more influence than others. It's been part of every single human society we ever know of, even back to hunter-gatherer tribes, right? There's always someone on top. For better or worse. And we made a lot of progress toward equality, but nonetheless, you still have people that are more influential than others. And you have to move them. So, you know, that's the goal of certain kind of liberal social norms, is to bring everyone in the circle, right? And then when certain people start getting, if you've got a reasonable voice on the other side that's excluded, then the unreasonable voice is the only one that remains, because they don't care about what anybody thinks. Right? They're just out there to either make money or whatever. So you really need an elite norm to be very, very careful about saying that a view is unreasonable. To use another term that's often used on the internet, we need a wider Overton window, that is the range of acceptable opinion. And because those norms create a certain kind of reflective person, right? And they help to privilege those reflective persons who are interested in dialogue over those who are just interested in attacking people, right? So part of it's just the responsibility of people to really check their own sense of who's sort of unreasonable, who has a reasonable opinion, who doesn't have a reasonable opinion. And that can be very difficult to do. So I think that's part of the story. Because you can get good attitude formation on social media. I mean, it can happen. People can do a lot of their own research, it makes them better. But on the other hand, it can make them a lot worse. So your first question was about the healthiness, you know, people forming their attitudes on social media. But then you asked a second question and I lost it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the first one was mostly if it was a good thing that we had these celebrities acting this way and using
the celebrity
status.
Question about Europe. Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure. I mean, I think if that's true, I'm not entirely sure it's true, but if it's true, it's just because Hollywood's in California. You know, the celebrities all live here, right? They're all part of the culture. They all speak the language. So I think that's has to be part of the reason. There are certain cultures where philosophers are given more attention, like France. I don't know if that's been better for them overall, but it's a very, very big difference. Germany too. I mean, you know, compare the relative influence of Habermas in Germany to Rawls in America. Habermas was massively influential, despite being a theorist who, frankly, you know, can get pretty lofty. pretty hard to read in some cases. But he has a huge influence because German culture is very different with respect to its intellectuals in the US. Rawls also has a very complex system, but had, as far as we can tell, no political influence. So American politics is kind of weird in that we really are unusually hostile to expertise. But what ends up happening is that people end up absorbing views anyway. And so you get the people out there who shoot their mouths off rather than people who are being reflective. So I think it's both the presence of Hollywood and our kind of anti-expertise culture.
Kevin, we are slowly reaching the, getting close to the end, and maybe we could get 2 quick questions in. Maybe Andrea Lebrescu and Mina Bose could both pose their questions briefly, and then you could have the last word in responding.
Yeah, I'll try to remember them both.
Thanks. Andrea?
Okay. I'm actually going to pick up on what's in the chat with Alicia Riggs, who was writing about voter issues. And the reason I'm picking up on that is, you, I think, give an impression of ultimate optimism that we can go back to a time where there will be more trust with these specific ways to get there. But it feels hard to be that optimistic in that, and I'll pick up the voter suppression issue in particular, in that the second this election's over, we have, literally hundreds of bills in 43 states to keep people from voting. And some of those people who turned the elections, and many of those people who are in high minority areas. So I guess my question is, on what do you base your optimism about that political institutions would be changing when the people in charge have a kind of anti-inclusive way of approaching voting, and some of the people in the Senate have moved from passing legislation to performative kind of CPAC, stand-up comedy sort of things, as opposed to legislation. And my final comment with that is, maybe that's why corporations put out things like Oreo puts out that it's in favor of trans rights, in that government doesn't seem to be passing anything. And there are people in government who were intent on not passing anything. And I have to label that in a partisan way, because, to act as though everyone's equally polarized seems to me to put a false equivalence on the party of no. That's my question.
Great. I know it's a little artificial to link these 2 questions together, but just in the, for the purposes of time, maybe you can pose your question, Mina, and then we'll give Kevin a chance to respond, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure, thank you for squeezing mine in. And it actually picks up on Andrea's last point. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. It's very instructive. I teach American politics in the presidency. And as I was listening to your lecture and your comments, I was thinking about Andrea's point about getting things done. And it seems to me that building social trust and relying on social trust for governance means an acceptance of Madisonian democracy that is very slow, very incremental policymaking, not the kind of bold, either far left, far right, but or extreme decisions or long-term decisions that may be in the national interest, but are simple or perceived that way, but are simply not consistent with social trust from perspectives in the political spectrum. So welcome your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so tough questions. Going with Andrea first, I think that I wrote this book before the 2020 election. I started writing in this area in 2015, 2016. And if I knew then what I knew now, I maybe would have been a little darker, admittedly. I didn't expect this raft of anti-voter. I thought at least, Trump would say there was fraud, and then over time it would just kind of go away. But there's a lot of people who still believe in it, and so that's why that's the rationale that the states are getting away with the voter suppression, because people think, wow, there was fake voting. Frankly, the only thing I know how to do is when local conditions, I like federalism a lot more than most people, but when the states go into modes of minoritarian rule in the past, we only solved them in one way, and that was with federal legislation. Now, you had to have social change on the ground so people would go along with them, but you're going to have to have federal legislation just to solve that problem. I don't see any other way around it. But I mean, that's what he had to do with civil rights, and it took a while. But so we've come out of worse. You know what I mean? We've come out of worse, and I think we can do it again. It's just a matter of recognizing the problem, and not everyone's going to agree with us, but we may need certain greater protections. So that's all I could say. We've done it before. We've got to have federal legislation, and we've done it before, and hopefully we can do it again. Now, we did it in a time where we were less polarized in terms of parties, but Civil Rights Act did split the Democrats, and it was arguably the basis for the realignment that started in '68. So it did have consequences, big ones, that may make further large changes much more difficult. So if you want to come back and get me super pessimistic, I guess even on that you can. But yeah, you're just going to have some kind of federal legislation. And I know, what about the filibuster? I kind of thought the Democrats were gonna smoke it. I really thought they were gonna get rid of it, but then they didn't. Because I mean, we already don't have mere majority rule. I mean, part of the point, and this is shifting to Mina, is that with bicameralism, you don't have straight majority rule because two majority votes can contradict each other. So if you've really got the Madisonian worry about us legislating too quickly, we already have two very powerful houses that can contradict each other. So we already have we have the Supreme Court, we have a lot of protections. So I think, we should do without the filibuster. And that would be a helpful change. And this gets to the getting things done question, which is that I think, as I understand it anyway, the original idea was something like the Electoral College or wise, the electors are supposed to be wise people who select a president. The Congress, the House is direct intervention of the people, but the senators are only supposed to be elected periodically so they can kind of slow down and be insulated from popular opinion too much. The judicial review, as I gather, was not an original power. There was no filibuster as far as I know. But that system was supposed to make it harder to legislate, and it still does, but we've created all of these extra norms and practices. I would say there's a lot of political philosophers who are skeptical of judicial review. It isn't used anywhere near as often as other countries. It creates a kind of super duper majority system. So we would need some sort of voting rule reforms. And here's something else I would say, even though I think this will never happen in the US, but it happens in other countries, so why not think about it, which is just having a parliamentary voting system where you vote for the party, and then if someone gets 30% of the votes, you get 30% of the seats. That'd be a good way. Most democracies do have two dominant parties, but they're oftentimes pretty powerful third parties. They have to publicly go into coalition with each other, which I think is a really healing thing. Imagine the Republicans and Democrats had to sort of get together and divide up cabinet offices. I think it would be very good for us. So you want a parliamentary system. And I think, and indeed, when we make recommendations from our elites, about how a country to become democratic, we recommend the parliamentary form anyway. Because presidential systems are just, known to have some more problems. At least that's my take on things. That would be a really big reform, but again, it's how most democracies operate. Here's something else I would add just at the end. I don't like presidential primaries. Most countries don't have them. The parties internally pick people that they think are moderate and can win, and then they run them and we choose between them. And that's democratic. I don't think we have to have democratic primaries. I think that the Republican Party would be in a lot better shape if, like the Democrats, they had super delegates, like they did in 2016. I think that one interesting thing about the Republican Party is that it's actually a pretty weak party in the sense that it's easily controlled by outside influences and can be captured by people that the party opposes. And I think it's much better for democracy if you have parties that can internally govern themselves and offer real opportunities to people based on what they think are best. Now that's more worrisome in a strictly two-party system, which is another reason I want there to be more than two viable parties. So anyway, forgive this light issue. So anyway, thanks for those questions. You know, you just try to say the things that you think will work. You try to look at other countries and see what they're doing. And even though it's hard to bring here, at least we have an idea of the direction we would want to go in.
So Kevin, thank you very much for this really interesting talk, really interesting Q&A. If this were a normal semester, we'd be taking you to lunch now with a group of students who want to talk further. We can't do that this year, but anyone who wants to join me and Professor Vallier tomorrow for a discussion between 1 and 2:25 in the afternoon, please just put your email address in the chat and we will send you a link so we can continue the conversation tomorrow. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.